The Mediterranean Sea was churning. Waves crashed against the steel hulls of the invasion fleet, the largest armada the world had ever seen up to that point. 3,000 ships, 160,000 men. On the bridge of the USS Monrovia, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr. peered through his binoculars at the smoking coastline of Jellah. He wore his polished cavalry boots, his custom-tailored breeches, and around his waist, the ivory-handled revolvers that were his trademark. He looked like a warrior king from a bygone era. But inside, he was seething. "Look at them," Patton growled to his aide, pointing east toward the British sector. "Monty gets the glory road. We get the scraps." Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, had been planned with one assumption. The British Eighth Army, led by the hero of El Alamein, Bernard Montgomery, would do the real fighting. They would land on the east, drive north up the coast road, capture the port of Messina, and cut off the German retreat. And the Americans? The Americans, led by Patton's Seventh Army, were designated as shield bearers. Their job was to land on the west, protect Monty's left flank, and sit still. They were the support act. The water boys. "General Alexander has made it clear, sir," his aide said cautiously. "We're to hold the line at Jellah and wait for the British to break through." Patton lowered his binoculars. His eyes were cold blue ice. "Hold? I don't know how to hold. I know how to attack. We're going to be sitting ducks on these beaches while Monty takes a Sunday stroll to Messina. But the war has a funny way of ruining plans." The beachhead. The landing was a bloodbath. The Italian Livorno Division and the terrifying German Hermann Göring Panzer Division hit the Americans hard. Tanks rolled onto the beaches while the GIs were still waist-deep in water. Patton didn't stay on the ship. He went ashore. He walked upright through the surf while mortar shells exploded around him, spraying sand and shrapnel. He grabbed terrified soldiers by the collar, shoving them forward. "Get up and kill them," he screamed. "Don't let them push you into the sea." By the third day, the Americans had secured the beachhead. They had beaten back the panzers. They were ready to move. But the order didn't come. July 13th, 1943. General Alexander's headquarters. General Harold Alexander, the British commander of the entire ground operation, looked at the map. He was an aristocrat, polite and polished. He viewed the Americans as enthusiastic amateurs, brave but undisciplined. "Monty is making progress," Alexander said, tapping the eastern coast of the map. "But the terrain is difficult. Mount Etna creates a natural fortress." "Sir," Patton interrupted, his voice straining with suppressed energy. "My Seventh Army is sitting in the dust. I have the men. I have the tanks. Let me drive north. Let me cut the island in half." Alexander shook his head. "No, George. Your orders stand. You protect Monty's flank. We don't want you overextending. Let the Eighth Army handle the heavy lifting." Patton walked out of the tent, his face a mask of fury. He climbed into his jeep. "Did you hear that?" He spat at his driver. "Protect his flank. I'm commanding an entire army, and he treats me like a flank guard." The stall. A week passed, and just as Patton predicted, Montgomery stopped. The British Eighth Army ran into a stone wall at the city of Catania. The Germans had dug in around the volcanic slopes of Mount Etna. The terrain was a nightmare. Narrow roads, steep cliffs, ancient stone bridges. Monty, for all his fame, was a cautious general. He didn't like to move until he had overwhelming superiority. So he stopped. He regrouped. He waited for artillery. The entire invasion ground to a halt. The Germans were laughing. They were holding off the great British army with a handful of paratroopers. Meanwhile, in the west, Patton was pacing his tent like a caged tiger. The dust was choking him. His men were bored. "This is criminal," Patton muttered, looking at the map. He traced a line with his finger. Not east toward Monty, but west, toward the capital city, Palermo. And then, along the northern coast road to Messina. "If Monty can't take Messina from the south," Patton whispered, "I'll take it from the north." But he had no orders. In fact, he had orders not to move. Patton called for his brilliant, rough-edged deputy commander, General Omar Bradley. "Brad," Patton said, pouring a whiskey, "I'm going to go see Alexander. I'm going to ask for a reconnaissance in force. Bradley raised an eyebrow. Reconnaissance? George, you're talking about taking an entire armored corps and driving 50 miles west. That's an invasion, not a reconnaissance. Patton grinned. It was a wolfish grin. It depends on how you define force, Brad. If I ask to capture Palermo, they'll say no. But if I ask to clear up the rear area, well, who knows where we might end up? The great lie. Patton flew to Alexander's headquarters. He played the part of the obedient soldier. He didn't ask to take Messina. He didn't ask for glory. He simply suggested that his army was vulnerable in the rear and needed to secure the western approaches. Alexander, distracted by Monty's failure at Catania, waved his hand. Fine, George. You can conduct a limited advance to the west. But do not, I repeat, do not, engage in a major offensive. We need you available to support Monty. Understood, sir, Patton said. He walked out of the tent, got into his plane, and flew back to his headquarters. As soon as his boots hit the ground, he turned to his corps commander, General Jeffrey Keyes. Jeffrey, Patton barked, I want you to drive on Palermo. I want you to go like hell. Don't stop for sleep. Don't stop for food. If you run out of gas, get out and push. I want Palermo in 5 days. Keyes looked at him. Sir, what about Alexander? What about the orders? Patton leaned in close. I didn't hear any orders telling me not to take Palermo. Did you? Keyes smiled. No, sir. Good. Now get moving. The Blitz. What happened next was one of the most spectacular dashes in military history. Patton unleashed the U.S. 7th Army. They didn't march, they sprinted. They tore through the Sicilian countryside. The Italian defenders, demoralized and terrified of the American cowboys, surrendered by the thousands. Patton's tanks were moving so fast that his own supply trucks couldn't keep up. They were capturing towns before the German command even knew they were under attack. Back at headquarters, Alexander was horrified. He saw the pins on the map moving west at impossible speeds. What is he doing? Alexander demanded. He's supposed to be doing a reconnaissance. He's conquering half the island. Alexander drafted an urgent cable to General Patton. Stop immediately. Do not advance beyond Agrigento. Repeat. Stop. The message was sent over the radio. Patton's signals officer, a young major, ran into Patton's tent with a decoded message. General, urgent message from Army Group. Patton didn't look up from his map. Is it good news? No, sir. It's an order to stop. Patton paused. He looked at the dust rising in the distance, where his tanks were roaring toward Palermo. He looked at the major. Major, Patton said calmly, tell me about the atmospheric conditions today. Are they interfering with radio transmission? The major blinked. Sir, the signal is clear. Patton stared at him. A terrifying stare. I said, Patton repeated slowly, the static is very bad today. Isn't it? In fact, I think this message might be garbled. The major swallowed hard. He understood. Yes, sir. Very garbled. Unreadable. Good, Patton said. Ask them to resend it. That should buy us 6 hours. By then, we'll be in Palermo. July 22nd, 1943. Palermo. The American tanks rolled into the ancient city of Palermo. The populace didn't shoot. They cheered. They threw flowers. Patton rode into the city like a Roman conqueror, standing in his command car, waving to the crowds. In just a few days, he had captured the capital of Sicily, taken 50,000 prisoners, and proved to the world that the American army was a juggernaut. When the news hit London and Washington, the headline screamed, Patton takes Palermo. Montgomery was still stuck in the mud at Catania. At Alexander's headquarters, the mood was sour. Patton had disobeyed the spirit of his orders, if not the letter. He had stolen the headlines. He had humiliated the British plan. Alexander finally got Patton on the radio. George, Alexander said, his voice icy. Congratulations on Palermo. You have had your fun. Now, you are ordered to stop. You will hold Palermo. The 8th Army will take Messina. Messina, the prize, the gateway to Italy. The city where the German army was escaping. Patton looked at the map. He was in Palermo, on the north coast. Messina was 150 miles east along a narrow, treacherous coastal road filled with bridges and tunnels. To get there, He would have to fight through the Devil's Cauldron. He would have to beat the Germans. And he would have to beat Montgomery, who was much closer. Patton liesiga. He looked at Bradley. Brad, Patton said, Monty thinks he owns this war. He thinks we're just here to carry his luggage. He took a puff of the cigar, the smoke curling around his helmet. I'm going to beat that son of a bitch to Messina, Patton vowed. And I don't care who I have to kill to do it, even if it's Alexander's career. The theft of Palermo was just the appetizer. The real race, the race that would tear the alliance apart and make history, was about to begin. The road from Palermo to Messina was not a road. It was a ribbon of death carved into the side of a cliff. To the left, a sheer drop of 500 feet into the Tyrrhenian Sea. To the right, jagged limestone mountains that touched the clouds. It was the perfect place for a defense and the worst place for an attack. The German commander, General Hans Valentin Hube, knew this. He had the elite 29th Panzer Grenadier Division. He knew he couldn't stop Patton's army, but he could bleed it. He could make every mile cost 100 American lives. Hube's engineers blew up every bridge. They collapsed every tunnel. They planted thousands of bouncing Betty mines that jumped to waist height before exploding. Patton stood in his jeep, dust coating his face, staring at a massive crater where a bridge used to be. The convoy was stalled. They blew the San Stefano Bridge. General, a colonel shouted over the noise of jackhammers. It's going to take the engineers 2 days to span this. 2 days, Patton screamed, jumping out of the jeep. He marched up to the edge of the crater. I don't have 2 days. Montgomery is crawling up the east coast. If I wait 2 days, he'll be drinking tea in Messina while we're still playing in the dirt. Patton turned to the engineer. Fill it, sir. I said fill it. Push the trucks into the hole if you have to. Use the rubble. I want tanks across this gap in 4 hours, or I will bust you back to private. The engineers worked like men possessed. They feared the Germans, but they feared old blood and guts Patton more. The betrayal. While Patton was fighting the terrain, a different kind of war was happening at Allied headquarters. Field Marshal Montgomery was frustrated. His 8th Army was still stuck at Catania, smashing its head against the German defenses at Mount Etna. He needed a new route. He looked at the map and saw the road Patton was using. Monty contacted General Alexander. Alex, Monty argued, the Americans are exhausted. They aren't professionals. I need that northern road. If you shift the boundary line, I can swing my troops around Etna and take Messina from the west. It was an insult. It was a theft. Montgomery wanted to cross into Patton's zone, take Patton's road, and steal Patton's victory. And Alexander agreed. When the order reached Patton's headquarters, the explosion was almost nuclear. They're doing what? Patton roared. He threw his helmet against the canvas wall of his tent. General Omar Bradley, usually calm, looked grim. They're shifting the boundary, George. They're giving our road to the British. We're ordered to stop and let the 8th Army pass through us. Patton's face turned a violent shade of purple. Over my dead body. Get the plane ready, Brad. We're going to headquarters. The showdown. Patton stormed into Alexander's office in Tunis like a hurricane. He didn't salute. He didn't sit. General Alexander, Patton barked. You are changing the history of this war for the sake of British pride. Alexander looked uncomfortable. George, be reasonable. Monty is stuck. He needs room to maneuver. Monty is stuck because he's too slow. Patton countered. I am moving. I have momentum. You want to stop a racehorse to let a donkey plod to the finish line? Alexander bristled. The 8th Army is the finest fighting force in... The 8th Army is tired. Patton interrupted. My boys are fresh. We took Palermo in 4 days. Give me the road. Give me the green light, and I will hand you Messina on a silver platter before Monty even finishes his breakfast. Alexander looked at Patton. He saw the fire in his eyes. He realized that if he stopped Patton now, the alliance might actually fracture. Patton was popular in the States. Sidelining him again would be a political disaster. All right, George, Alexander sighed. I'll keep the boundary where it is. But you have to keep moving. If you stall, I'm giving the road to Monty. Patton grinned. It was the grin of a shark that just smelled blood. I won't stall. The leapfrogs. Patton returned to the front with a new plan. The Germans were blowing the tunnels, blocking the road. Frontal assaults were taking too long. If we can't go through them, Patton told Bradley, we'll go around them. He pointed to the sea. I want amphibious landings. I want to put battalions on boats and drop them behind the German lines. Like leapfrog. We catch them by surprise, shoot them in the ass, and keep moving. Bradley was skeptical. George, that's risky. If the Germans turn around, those men will be cut off. War is risk, Brad. Patton snapped. Do it. August 8th, 1943. San Fratello. The first leapfrog landing. It was chaotic. The Americans landed behind the German lines at San Fratello. The Germans, realizing they were surrounded, panicked. The American infantry fought vicious hand-to-hand battles in the olive groves. It worked. The German line collapsed. Patton's tanks surged forward. But the cost was high. The hospitals were filling up. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion, malaria, and shell shock. One afternoon, Patton visited a field hospital. He wanted to see the wounded heroes. He walked among the stretchers, praising the men with missing limbs and bandaged heads. Then he saw a soldier sitting on a crate, crying. There was no blood on him. What's wrong with you, soldier? Patton asked, towering over him. It's my nerves, sir, the soldier sobbed. I can't take the shelling anymore. The sympathy vanished from Patton's face. In his world, cowardice was a disease that could infect the whole army. Your nerves? Patton shouted. His voice echoed through the hospital tent. Al, you're just a goddamn coward. You're shutting yourself up in here while brave men die. Patton slapped the soldier across the helmet. He grabbed him by the collar and threw him out of the tent. Get him back to the front. Patton ordered the doctors. I won't have cowards stinking up my hospital. The incident would later nearly destroy Patton's career. But in that moment, on that dusty road to Messina, it showed his obsession. He was driving his men beyond the breaking point, because he was beyond the breaking point. The final stretch. It was mid-August. The heat was unbearable. The race was neck and neck. On the East Coast, Montgomery had finally broken through. The British were moving north, taking town after town. They were only 30 miles from Messina. On the North Coast, Patton was 40 miles away. But the Germans were fighting harder against the Americans, desperate to hold the escape route open. Patton was in his command car, listening to the radio reports. Monty is at Taormina, Bradley reported. He's got a clear shot to Messina. Patton looked at his watch. Get General Truscott on the line. Lucian Truscott was commanding the lead division. Lucian, Patton screamed into the radio. I don't care if you have to carry the tanks on your backs. I don't care if you have to swim. I want you in Messina before the British. Do you hear me? If I see a British helmet in that city before an American one, I will relieve you of command. August 16th, 1943. The Germans were fleeing. They were ferrying their troops across the straits to Italy. Messina was burning. The British vanguard was approaching from the south. They could see the smoke of the city. A British patrol car, led by a major, was driving fast, hoping to claim the prize for the Empire. But on the northern road, a cloud of dust was rising. It was the U.S. 3rd Infantry Division. They were running, literally running. Patton was with them. He wasn't in the rear. He was right behind the lead tank. Faster, he yelled. Faster. They hit the outskirts of Messina. The streets were rubble. Sniper fire cracked from the windows. The Americans didn't stop. They plowed through the barricades. At 10 p.m. on August 16th, an American patrol entered the city center. Patton rolled in the next morning. The meeting. The city was silent. The Germans were gone. The civilians were hiding. Patton drove to the city hall. He got out of his Jeep. He dusted off his uniform. He adjusted his helmet. He looked at his watch. About an hour later, a column of British tanks rolled into the main square. A British officer popped out of the hatch. He looked tired. He looked dusty. He looked like a man who thought he was the winner. Then he saw George Patton standing on the steps of City Hall, smoking a cigar, his arms crossed. Patton smiled. Hello, Patton called out. What took you so long? The British officer's jaw dropped. Patton had done the impossible. He had taken the support army, traveled 3 times the distance over the worst terrain in Europe, and beaten the favorite to the finish line. But the race wasn't just about a city. It was about respect. And as Patton stood there, watching the British roll in, he knew he had stolen something much bigger than an island. He had stolen the spotlight, and the war would never be the same again. But victory has a hangover. And while Patton was celebrating, the telegram regarding this slapping incident was landing on Eisenhower's desk. Patton had won the race, but he was about to lose his command. The dust had settled over the ruined port city. The American flag was already flying over City Hall when the lead column of the British Eighth Army finally rumbled into the square. A British staff car pulled up. Out stepped a brigadier general representing Montgomery. He looked at the Americans, dirty, unshaven, but grinning like Cheshire cats. He looked at Patton, who was standing tall, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the Mediterranean sun. The British officer saluted. It was a stiff, reluctant salute. "General Patton," the officer said. "Field Marshal Montgomery sends his congratulations." Patton returned the salute with a casual flick of his wrist. "Tell Monty he's late. I've already picked out the best villa for my headquarters. But tell him I save him a spot in the guest house." It was the ultimate insult. Patton hadn't just beaten Montgomery. He had shattered the myth of British military superiority. For the first time in the war, the American army had proven it could move faster, hit harder, and outmaneuver the veterans of the empire. But hubris is a dangerous thing. The scandal breaks. While the soldiers were celebrating in Messina, a different kind of bomb was detonating in Washington, D.C. The journalist Drew Pearson went on the radio. He told the world about this slapping incident. He told the story of the shell-shocked soldier, Charles Cole, whom Patton had struck and called a coward in the medical tent. The reaction was instantaneous. The American public, who loved Patton's victories, were horrified by his brutality. Members of Congress demanded his head. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, sat in his office in Algiers. He held a lit cigarette in shaking fingers. He loved Patton like a brother. He knew Patton was the best combat general he had. But he also knew that the alliance was fragile. "I have to fire him," Eisenhower told his staff. "If I don't, I lose the public. If I keep him, I look like I condone abuse." He summoned Patton. The meeting was brutal. Patton, the conqueror of Sicily, stood before Eisenhower like a naughty schoolboy. "George," Eisenhower said, his voice cold, "you have won a great victory, but you have acted like a savage. You will apologize to that soldier. You will apologize to every unit in your army. And until further notice, you are relieved of command." Patton was crushed. He had won the race, but he had lost his army. The ghost general, England. The greatest invasion in history, D-Day, was being planned. The Allies were going to storm the beaches of Normandy. Every general wanted a piece of the action. Bradley was given an army. Montgomery was given the ground command. And Patton? Patton was given a balloon. He was placed in command of the Fusag, the 1st United States Army Group. It sounded impressive. In reality, it was a fake army. It was made of inflatable rubber tanks, plywood airplanes, and empty tents set up in the fields of Dover. It was a decoy, Operation Fortitude. The Allied intelligence knew that the German High Command respected only one Allied general, George Patton. They believed that wherever Patton was, the real attack would come. So, the Allies used Patton as a scarecrow. They let him sit in Dover, looking across the channel at Pas-de-Calais, to trick Hitler into thinking the invasion would happen there. Patton paced his room in England, watching the rain hit the window. He was depressed. He drank too much. "I am a racehorse in a stable," he wrote in his diary, "while donkeys are leading the charge." On June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed at Normandy, Patton listened to the reports on the radio. He wasn't there. The man who had taken Messina was sitting in a farmhouse in England, walking his dog. It seemed like the end of the legend, the breakout. But war is long, and donkeys eventually get stuck. By July 1944, the Allies were bogged down in the hedgerows of Normandy. Montgomery was stalled at Caen again. Bradley was fighting for every inch. The advance had stopped. Eisenhower knew he needed a sledgehammer. He needed speed. He needed violence. He picked up the phone. "Give me Patton." Patton arrived in France in secrecy. He was given the Third Army. When he climbed into his jeep, he looked at his driver. The depression was gone. The fire was back. Drive, Patton said. What followed was the Cobra breakout. Patton didn't just advance. He exploded across France. He moved faster than any army in history, covering 60 miles a day. He bypassed resistance, ignored his flanks, and drove straight for the German throat. He was using the same tactics he learned in the race to Messina. Speed is security. The winter of 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. December. The Germans launched a massive, desperate surprise attack in the Ardennes forest. They smashed through the American lines. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded at Bastogne, freezing and out of ammunition. At the Allied headquarters in Verdun, the mood was panicked. The generals were looking at the map, seeing disaster. Eisenhower turned to Patton. George, I need you to attack the southern flank of the German Bulge. How long will it take you to turn your entire army 90 degrees and march north? Any other general would have said 2 weeks. It involved moving 250,000 men, thousands of tanks, and tons of supplies in the middle of a blizzard. Patton didn't blink. I can attack in 48 hours. The room went silent. The other generals laughed nervously. It was impossible. I'm serious, George, Eisenhower said. So am I, Patton replied. My boys are already moving. And they were. Patton drove the Third Army through the snow, through the ice, through the impossible. They hit the German flank like a freight train. On December 26th, Patton's tanks broke the siege of Bastogne. He had saved the Allied cause. Epilogue, the last race. Messina was the training ground. It was the crucible where George Patton proved that the American doctrine of speed and aggression could defeat the rigid discipline of the Germans and the methodical caution of the British. The race to Messina wasn't just about an island. It was about the soul of the American army. Before Sicily, the Americans were the junior partners. After Sicily, they were the masters of the battlefield. Years later, after Patton had died in a car accident in Germany, a warrior who died not by the bullet, but by bad luck, General Omar Bradley was asked about the race to Messina. Was it necessary? The reporter asked. Did Patton need to steal the road from Montgomery? Did he need to push his men so hard? Bradley smiled. He remembered the dust, the heat, and the sheer force of will that was George Patton. Necessary? Bradley mused. Strategically, maybe not. Monty would have gotten there eventually. But spiritually? Yes. It was necessary. Why? Because, Bradley said, Patton showed us that we didn't have to wait for anyone. He taught the American army that it could run. In the history books, the capture of Messina is often a footnote. But for the men who were there, for the men who saw the dust cloud of Patton's tanks beating the British to the prize, it was the moment the eagle finally learned to hunt. Patton stole the island. He stole the glory. But in doing so, he gave the Allies the one thing they needed most to win the war: belief.